So if you love the Turbo R and you fancy upgrading to something a little bit more modern, something that doesn't suffer quite so many age-related issues perhaps, what about the Arnage, the next generation of Bentley? Is it as special as the Turbo R? Has it still got that special Bentley something? Let's find out. The modern breed of Bentleys, starting with the Continental GT, is really very different from the Turbo R generation. But this Arnage, you can see where it came from. It feels much like you'd expect, an evolution of the Turbo R generation. It feels like a big, comfy limo, but one that's got a blistering pace if you want it. You sit up high, higher than the average car, a little bit like the Turbo R, but in many other ways it's completely different. I've done a lot of miles in our Turbo R recently, and just stepping into this Arnage, I immediately notice the rigidity of the body shell. It just feels so much more solid. Just clumping over potholes and things on this country road here, there's none of the shuddering that you get in the older cars, and it does feel like you'd expect a much more modern car. As it should do, really. It was engineered in the modern era, whereas the Turbo R, of course, was basically a silver shadow underneath. The other thing you notice is all the BMW switchgear, and if you're familiar with BMWs, you notice all the little BMW parts. There's 7 Series heater controls here, and this is obviously a 7 Series steering wheel. Rolls-royce under Vickers, they just didn't have the money to develop a whole new car, so they got as far as developing the body shell really, and then all the rest was supplied by BMW, the drivetrain, all the electronics, architecture, and everything else. The fascinating thing about the Arnage, of course, is that it did start life with a BMW engine as well. It was only when the BMW VW dispute was settled that the worries over engine supply meant that VW had to hastily bring out the V8, dust it off, and fit it in the Arnage. They had to re-engineer the front of the car because the V8 engine was so much heavier than the BMW V8, but it gave the car a completely different character. It's interesting that what we've got here is basically an evolution of the V8 engine on our own Turbo R, but it feels a lot more modern. It certainly feels a lot more refined. The soundproofing and the general refinement is so much greater than the older cars. Certainly the old Turbo R, which began life as the Mulsanne Turbo, was a Silver Spirit which had a turbo added to it. This, you feel that the car was designed for the power it has from the start. Like the Turbo R, this is a big, heavy car, but it feels a lot easier to drive than the Turbo R for those who are coming from a regular car. It feels easier to place on the road. It feels that little bit more precise. It's definitely a lot more conventional to drive, the Arnage. You haven't got the old column shift that you've got in the older Turbo Rs. You've got regular column stalks, headlight switches and things like that. You could step out of a 7 Series or an S-Class or something, you'd probably know where all the controls are, and it feels more familiar if you're not used to the older generation of Rolls and Bentley. So what's it like to live with one of these cars? They are, after all, a lot more modern than the Turbo R, but they are, of course, still quite an old car. Well, to find out, we spoke to the experts.
Obviously, this is one of our test cars, and I bought it, done about 41,000 miles, I think, and now 112,000, so I've driven this a lot. Vickers, when they sold Rolls-Royce to BMW, quite rapidly, of course, Bentley was split and sold to VW. VW, Audi and BMW are not, shall we say, closest of friends. Is much harder for a company like VW because their platform's different. We are now seeing the need for companies like ours to develop products. There are some availability issues, but I think that the support for these is still pretty good. There was certainly a big furore when they first brought out the Arnage because it had the 4.5 litre twin turbo BMW engine, which has been, I think, a bit unfairly termed as sort of a sewing machine. If you're going to be a real purist, then you need to be starting to go back to the crew-built Rolls-Royce, as it were. This has got the Bentley V8. So red label Arnages have the V8 engine. Just check if the head gaskets have been done. They seem to go about between 60 and 80,000 miles. That seems to be about when they go. Not always, obviously, but we're currently developing our own upgraded gasket from the original, which we expect wouldn't have the problems. Beware early cars if you're bigger than average. They drop the floor pan on these to accommodate Bentley owners, because Bentley owners, weirdly enough, are bigger. It's another thing to look out for in the early cars. Corrosion can be a problem. They weren't corrosion proofed at the factory. Apparently that was for weight reasons, but it's already 3 tons, so I'm not sure that a bit of wax oil's that heavy. So that's something you need to look out for, particularly underneath. But none of this is rocket science for anyone who's used to buying classic cars or cars of this era. This is exactly the sort of thing you would do with any car. I think they're stylish, they don't date, they've got presence, but they need a bit of TLC as well, of course.
You also notice that the refinement is massively increased over the old generation. In their day, they were impressive for their refinement and their pace and their size and everything, but this, by any standards, is a refined car. I mean, we got a lot of power here, big fat tyres, and it's a bumpy country road, but it just feels so much quieter and more refined than our own Turbo R. The engine is just a distant sort of rumble, and it's really very refined. What hasn't changed over the older generation is the really unlikely combination of sheer bulk and speed. You've only got to squeeze it and it just pushes you forwards. No drama, nothing, and it's much quieter than the Turbo R. You've got the more modern gearbox, which makes a big difference actually as well. Ours is a 3-speed, the Turbo R, and you definitely notice the changes thumping home. This one you don't, it just pushes you down the road seamlessly. It's a little bit damp, so I don't want to push it, but it just feels secure. Even cornering. Pheasant! And the brakes are really good. There's a live pheasant still strutting across the road. It's not without character though. Refined it might be, modern it might be, but it still has a lovely character. There's nothing else quite like this. If you drive even a 750 or 760 BMW, none of them feel quite like this. It does still feel like a Bentley. And I'd say to someone who's looking to trade up maybe from a much loved Turbo R, the Arnage fits the bill.